But first we come to the analytical results, and the first main analytical result is that we can prove existence and uniqueness of the equilibrium. So the employment in research and development exists and it's positive, and for this equilibrium, we can show that the standard results of the endogenous growth model of Roma prevail. So we have that higher research productivity increases, technological progress and economic growth, and so on and so forth. However, the model is richer and we have additional results to which we come now. The second central analytical result is that we can show that technological progress is skill biased. So the high skilled wages rise with technological progress, while the low skilled wages stagnate, at least in the long run equilibrium, when no additional workers choose to become high skilled with an increasing skill premium. So that means faster economic growth implies higher wage inequality, and that's consistent with the empirical evidence over the last decades when the skill premium was increasing, despite the fact that we had additional ever more people obtaining a college degree. The third result is that there is a declining labor income share. And the reason for that is that we have high skilled workers whose wages increase with technological progress, and low skilled workers whose wages do not increase with technological progress. So if we compute the labor income share by definition, then we would get that the wages of high skilled workers, there the aggregate GDP drops out and we have the constant 1 minus alpha, but we also have the wages of low skilled workers, which is divided by GDP, and the wages of these workers does not change with GDP. So actually the numerator does not change. If at all, it even decreases because some low-skilled workers choose to become high-skilled during the transition. And that means that this second part here, the low-skilled labor share, declines and converges basically to zero. That means that the overall labor income share converges from above to a constant in the long run. Now, this decreasing labor income share would also be consistent with the empirical evidence since the 1970s and 1980s. What we can also show as a fourth central result is that the share of wealth held by high-skilled workers increases. So wealth concentration basically is increasing. How can we see this? Well, we can compute savings, the share of savings of high-skilled workers, which is income of high-skilled workers, multiplied by the saving rate divided by overall savings, which is income of high-skilled workers plus income of low-skilled workers multiplied by the saving rate. So the saving rate drops out and we have income of high-skilled workers divided by total labor income. Now we know, however, that with an increasing GDP actually, as GDP increases, this part here of the wage income of low-skilled workers becomes less and less important. So the whole expression here converges to 1 with a growing economy. So total share of wealth held in the long run by high-skilled workers would converge to 1, and we would see increasing wealth concentration during the transition, which is again consistent with the empirical evidence. And finally, we can explain skill upgrading, or the race between education and technology that we have seen in many countries, particularly in the United States over the last decades, where a larger and larger share of the population obtains a college degree. And the mechanism in the model is that they would like to escape wage stagnation. So when they would stay low skilled, their wages would stagnate in the long run. But one option to keep up with technological progress is to invest in a college degree and benefit from increasing wages. So more and more people would start to obtain a college degree. But at some point, the ability constraint would become binding. So initially, for a low skill premium, only the people with the highest ability for which a college degree imposes least effort choose to obtain a college degree. And then with an increasing skill premium, ever more people with lower ability would obtain a college degree. And in the long run, we would reach this bowl actually to which the share of people with a college degree would converge. Now, this would mean, by means of stylized facts, that we see an increasing share of college graduates in the population. That's the case for the United States. And this increase in the share is leveling off to some extent. So it's concave, because in the model the mechanism is the ability constraint, but that would be consistent with the implication of the model, namely that we see a leveling off of this increase in education. So also this implication of the model, this race between technology and education, is actually supported by empirical evidence. Now, that's so far what we can show analytically in the paper, and from here we would have to proceed numerically to obtain additional results during the transition period and additional results for economic policies, where we increase the taxes and analyze what happens when we consider redistribution towards those, for example, who do not benefit from technological progress, or towards those who choose a college degree, which would be an education subsidy. To obtain numerical results, we calibrate the model and choose the parameter values such that we more or less fit to the United States trajectory. So in this graph here, the blue line is the model trajectory, so the implied trajectory of the model simulated from 1950 up to 2100, and the red dashed line is the data for the United States. Now, we have here DFB growth in the first diagram, the share of graduates in the economy in the second diagram, the research and development share, so the number of people working in the R&D sector, in the third diagram, and the ratio of high-skilled to low-skilled wages in the fourth diagram. What we see is that we get the level of DFB growth approximately right. We overestimated a little bit, and it's still increasing at first, but then it decreases, and in the very long run it would decrease further. So at least we get the prediction approximately right, that DFB growth is not increasing by too much when the share of graduates increases. That's here. Then we get the implication that the share of graduates rises, which other growth models, to be clear, do not contain. So endogenously the share of people with a college degree increases, and it settles down in the long run to a constant share because we hit the ability constraint. The share of people working in the R&D sector, we also get an increase, right? But we somehow overestimate this increase to some extent with the modeling framework. And for the wage ratio, we also project an increase, but this increase would speed up basically, and there would be a further increase in the wage ratio. But we get, from the calibration perspective, we get the increase in the skill premium that we observe throughout the second half of the 20th century about right. Now, considering here the data and the model implications, we can claim that the model does not imply trajectories that are completely out of line with the data, and therefore we use this model to perform policy experiments at the moment. And one of the most prominent policy examples that is often considered also in connection with automation is a redistribution towards the poor in this sense, and the poor in our situation would be the ones who do not benefit from automation, the ones who did not obtain a college degree. So we simulate an increase in the taxes. We consider two scenarios, one in which the robot tax is used to finance the redistribution, and the other one where the wage tax is used to finance redistribution. To make the comparison fair, what we do is we compute the wage tax that would lead to the same revenue as a 5% robot tax. So in the graphs here, we have the scenario with the robot tax, that's the green dashed line, and the scenario with the wage tax is the red dashed line. And basically the comparison is made fair, that we assume that in the implementation period, both of these taxes have to yield the same revenue, and therefore we adjust the wage tax, and it has to be 0.103 to yield the same revenue as a robot tax of 5%. So now, what do we see here? Basically, we see that up to the year 2000, where we assume that the policy is implemented in the year 2000, the basic version of the model, the one with the robot tax and the one with the wage tax, yield the same trajectories in terms of TFP growth, the share of graduates, the research and development share in the labor force, the pre-tax income ratio of low-skilled wages to high-skilled wages, and the income of low-skilled workers. And then from the year 2000 onwards, things change. So what we see here is that if we do a redistribution, then basically, irrespective of whether it's financed by a robot tax or a wage tax, what we have is a lower share of graduates. And that's reasonable because basically we subsidize to not educate oneself, because only those who do not have education, only the ones who are harmed by automation, get this subsidy. So that means a lower share of graduates during the transition. In the long run, we still converge to the ability threshold level. Now that leads, of course, to a lower number of high-skilled workers, and therefore a lower R&D share, and therefore lower TFP growth. But in exchange, what we get is lower wage inequality, because the pre-tax income ratio reduces slightly, at least if we finance it with a robot tax, and in the medium run also slightly when we finance it with a wage tax. And overall, the low-skilled income increases now in the long run. It does not stagnate as in the basic version of the model, where the wages of low-skilled workers do not rise anymore, because in the long run the ability threshold is hit and no low-skilled workers choose to educate themselves anymore for rising skill premiums, so the wages of low-skilled workers would stagnate. But here their income is still allowed to grow because they benefit from redistribution from those who benefit from automation. So what we get is a classical equity efficiency trade-off in some sense. So we sacrifice growth, and in exchange we get a reduction in inequality. And this trade-off is more pronounced for a robot tax. So if we finance the redistribution with a robot tax, the reduction in growth is stronger, but also the reduction in the income ratio is less pronounced. And the income of low-skilled workers are allowed to grow a bit faster in the long run with the robot tax. So we get an equity efficiency trade-off, and we have to sacrifice growth in order to get lower income with this scenario. And the robot tax leads to more pronounced effects. Now, another policy that is often suggested in this context is to subsidize education. So what we do now is to simulate an education subsidy, and that's basically a subsidy for those with a college degree. So if you obtain a college degree, then you get the subsidy. We again use the same tax rates for this scenario, and look what happens to TFP growth, the share of graduates, the research and development share, the pre-tax income ratio, and the low-skilled income. Now what we see, and what's a bit surprising perhaps, is that only if we finance the redistribution by a wage tax is it indeed the case that more people educate themselves. So the graduate share increases, therefore more people work in the research and development sector, and TFP growth increases, all in the medium run, because again in the long run we converge to the basic solution. But if we finance the redistribution by robot tax, then we still have that the graduate share is slightly lower than in the baseline situation. R&D is lower and TFP growth is lower. And the reason for that is that the disincentive effect of a robot tax, such that people do not want to invest in new robots then, outweighs the positive effects that you would get on growth by the education subsidy. And only if the education subsidy is financed by wage taxation would we get this positive growth effect. Now, if we finance the redistribution by robot tax, we get a reduction in inequality, but financed by wage tax, we do not really get a reduction in inequality. And the low-skilled wages actually are even harmed by this policy, or the low-skilled income, because basically they have to pay for the redistribution and do not benefit by the redistribution. So the tax is paid by all, but the benefits go to the ones who educate themselves, so to the ones who anyway benefit from automation. So there are some surprising effects of this subsidy. Now, so far, we've seen that we can explain with this automation augmented R&D-based growth model some of the empirical regularities that we cannot explain with standard R&D-based growth theory. So we can explain the evolution of inequality that we've observed over the last decades. We can explain a declining labor income share. We can explain increasing wealth inequality and the rising share of people with a college degree. And furthermore, we can use the model to analyze the effects of policies like robot tax or a wage tax and redistribution, that is, a redistribution towards those who suffer because of automation, or a redistribution in the sense of an education subsidy. However, the model was so far silent on unemployment considerations. And that's basically one of the fears in the whole automation debate, that people think this could lead to a situation where technological unemployment actually rises. So now we want to introduce a possibility for unemployment in the model. And here, the way we do this is by using Akerlof and Yellen's fair wage theory. So we assume that effort at work itself depends on the wage rate and whether one considers her own wage as fair, to be perceived as fair. So E is effort at work, and basically it's the minimum between the ratio of one's own wage to a reference wage and 1. So if the reference wage of another group, or so in the labor market to which people compare themselves, is higher than my own wage, then probably I would exert less effort because I perceive my own wage as unfair as compared to others in the economy. And only if the reference wage would be lower, then I would exert full effort. So then the production function would have to be adapted, because that's where both workers meet, the high-skilled and the low-skilled workers, and we multiply the high-skilled labor supply by effort of high-skilled workers and low-skilled labor supply by effort of low-skilled workers in this production function. Now, the first thing that we need to know here is how people form their reference wages for the comparison. And here we assume that the reference wage is a weighted average of one's own wage and the wage of others that I observe. And the own wage would be the market clearing wage that we denote by a C in the superscript. Now, for low-skilled workers, the reference wage would then be the weight mu, which is the strength of wage comparisons of the wages of the other group, of the high-skilled workers, plus 1 minus mu, the market clearing wage for low-skilled workers. And for high-skilled workers, it would be mu times the wage of low-skilled workers plus 1 minus mu times the market clearing wage of high-skilled workers. And then we can plug in, because we know the market clearing wages from the model, from the inverse demand functions for labor in the final goods sector that came out from the profit maximization problem in the final goods sector. If we just assume that labor supply of skill group J, which can either be low skilled or high skilled workers, is exogenously given, which we denote by an uppercase, by a bar over the variable here. So once we plug this in, we know the market clearing wages for high-skilled workers and the market clearing wages for low-skilled workers. And what will always hold here is that high-skilled workers will perceive their wage as fair, because the high-skilled wage exceeds the market clearing exceeds the wage of low-skilled workers, and therefore from the wage comparison, high-skilled workers will always exert full effort. However, low-skilled workers might not perceive their wage as fair, and in this case, we need two equations to determine the labor market equilibrium in terms of labor supply and wages, and therefore also unemployment later on. And the first is the indirect demand function for low-skilled labor, which is just the equation that comes out of the profit maximization problem of final goods producers that we already know, where we set labor supply of high-skilled workers and labor supply of low-skilled workers exogenous. And we see this is downward sloping, of course. So if we have more low-skilled workers, the exponent is negative because alpha is smaller than 1. that means that more low-skilled workers lead to a lower wage. So we have a downward sloping inverse labor demand curve as it is standard. However, we have a second equation, and that's the fair wage constraint for low-skilled workers. So that's basically from this expression here, where we plug in the wages of high-skilled workers and assume that the wages of high-skilled workers are the labor market clearing wages of high-skilled workers. So we plug this expression then into the reference wage expression for low-skilled workers, and we get this expression here, which basically yields us the wage rate for low-skilled workers at which they would find that their wages are fair. So they would exert full effort if this condition is fulfilled. Now what we see here is that also this expression for the wage depends on low-skilled labor supply. But since this shows up here with a positive exponent alpha, and here with the same exponent as here, alpha minus 1, we know that it has kind of a flatter slope than this curve here. And probably the slope might even be positive, so it might be an upward sloping curve. And on the next slide, we show how we can depict this equilibrium by means of the two equations here graphically. So here we show this graphically. We have on the horizontal axis low-skilled employment and low-skilled labor supply, and on the vertical axis we have the wage rate. Now the labor demand curve is downward sloping. We know this from here. The exponent is negative, so we have a downward sloping curve here. Now in the baseline version of the model, without any unemployment, with inelastic labor supply, we would have labor supply here exogenously given, and the market equilibrium would be here at the low wage at the intersection of labor demand and exogenous labor supply, and we would have full employment. Here, however, the labor market equilibrium is determined by the intersection of the labor demand curve and the fair wage constraint, which is now upward sloping as we draw it here, but at least it's definitely less downward sloping, so the slope is less steep, and it would definitely intersect the labor demand curve at some point in the interior of the graph. But here we have this intersection for a positive slope of the fair wage constraint. So now the labor market equilibrium is at the point of intersection between the fair wage constraint and the labor demand curve at an employment level of LL0. And now we would have unemployment as the difference between exogenous labor supply LL0 bar and employment in equilibrium LL0. So this extension of the model leads to a situation where we have equilibrium involuntary unemployment. Now we can consider what happens if technological progress takes place and A increases. So we have technological progress and A rises. Now we see A does not show up in the labor demand curve, so the labor demand curve stays unaffected, but A shows up in a positive manner in the fair wage constraint, so this would change. Now ceteris paribus, assuming that labor supply of low-skilled workers does not change, we see that the fair wage constraint would shift upwards, and we would have an intersection with the labor demand curve at the lower employment level and at the higher wage. That's clear because low-skilled workers would perceive their wage increasingly as unfair if the wage of high-skilled workers increases, so they would demand themselves higher wages. But since we have market, it's much higher than their market clearing wages, that would reduce employment in equilibrium and increase unemployment. So ceteris paribus, this innovation would lead to higher unemployment. However, at least during the transition, when we did not yet hit the ability constraint on the education sector for people obtaining a college degree, we would still have the situation that also labor supply of low-skilled workers would decrease because some of them would choose to obtain a college degree when they see the wages of high-skilled workers increase. So that would shift labor supply inwards, and a priori we could not say which of the two effects is greater. So we could see a situation where technological progress then leads to a stronger shift of labor supply inwards than we have an upward shift of the fair wage constraint, such that unemployment even decreases. So that's possible. In the long run, however, we would always at some point reach this ability constraint. So in the long run, we would always have the situation that technological progress leads to higher unemployment. But in the transition period, we could have the situation that unemployment even decreases in response to technological progress. So we summarize this here as another analytical finding that in the long run, we can show that unemployment rises with technological progress, but in the transition period, basically, we cannot show which of the two effects is larger, so we do not know how the, unemployment reacts to technological progress. Now, what do we find from a numerical perspective? Again, under the policies that we had with a tax rate of 5% on robots and 10.4% on wages, which is the equivalent tax in terms of revenues, and also in the baseline simulation of the model. So when we simulate the model with this possibility of endogenous effort and therefore technological unemployment, we would see that basically the unemployment rate stays rather stable for quite a long time actually, and only then starts to increase. If we implement a robot tax, then this slows the increase in technological unemployment down, of course, because we disincentivize the investment in machines and robots, and therefore we disincentivize substituting robots for workers. In terms of inequality, not that much changes because now we have another adjustment channel, the unemployment rate, by which lots of that plays out. But still, we would have this type of equity efficiency trade-off. So if we implement the tax, we get less growth actually, and by a little bit of a reduction in inequality by that. Well, so now we can conclude that we've presented a research and development based growth model with automation, and we've shown that in such a model there is a declining labor income share, which is consistent with the empirical evidence. One would have rising income and wealth inequality, which is also consistent with the empirical evidence. Then one can explain the increasing share of college educated workers over the last decades. So this explains one of the stylized facts that we see empirically, and one could potentially explain technological unemployment in the model, but arguably this is not yet the situation that we observe in reality, and we would still be in the situation of the model where unemployment does not rise as strongly as one might be afraid of. Overall, what we can say is that those who are low ability types without the possibility to go to the university and college would be the ones who lose the race against the machine, and it's rather difficult to come up with policies that would actually help these type of workers. Policies that could help in this situation is one could ensure that everybody has a certain stake in the wealth of a country, which might be by certain types of guaranteeing payments in shares, but there would be a problem, of course, for family firms or public employees or people who are unemployed at the moment. Then there is a possibility that Giacomo Corneo has described, like creating a public fund that pays a dividend to everybody in the country. So it's a little bit a weaker form of a basic income. And he suggests that the government should actually invest in foreign shares and pay out the return on investment to its citizens. Of course, this is a very interesting mechanism, but it could run into limits when all countries do that, because then the gap between the interest rate that governments have to pay on their borrowings and the rate of return on asset markets would very likely decrease. And of course, all types of strengthening social insurance mechanisms that ensure that those with low ability types who have no possibility to educate themselves are helped would also bring relief in this context. Okay, so thank you for your attention.